Good evening. Hello, I'm Karen Nelson. I'm Dean of the School of Architecture at the Boston Architectural College, where we promote educational initiatives across the boundaries of landscape architecture, architecture, interior architecture, and design studies. And I want to welcome you to a very special event at the college. It's our annual Cascieri Lectureship in the Humanities. The late Dean Arcangelo Cascieri was at the BAC for 47 years as a volunteer. And when I began teaching here in 1994, I would pass him as he walked very eloquently and elegantly with his cane and his beret. And it is why on graduation day, those students in this room who graduate will be able to toss their beret in the air instead of a mortarboard. That is to honor Dean Cascieri. So Dean Cascieri was an architectural sculptor. He worked primarily on the interiors of churches. And as a sculptor, he tried to create beauty daily. He believed that we as students and as makers seek our own answers to urban and architectural problems based on the spiritual and physical needs of individuals. To extend that thinking and the traditions of the Dean, the BAC has invited James Timberlake to be our 25th lecturer in the humanities. I'm going to now introduce President Glenn Leroy, and he will further introduce James Timberlake.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. It is a pleasure for me to introduce James Timberlake, and I'll just give you a little bit about his background, and it's a stellar background, and I had a list that was about 4 or 5 times the length of the list I'm going to give you. So with James, apologies to James, I did edit it down because I would take up your whole lecture otherwise. But he received his bachelor's degree from the University of Detroit and then went off and got his master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania, and I think we might have been concurrent there, or close to it. He was named a Fellow of the American Academy in Rome in the 1980s. He was one of the inaugural recipients of the Benjamin Latrobe Fellowship for Architectural Design Research from the AIA's College of Fellows in 2001 through 2003. And he was appointed by the Obama administration to serve on the board of the National Institute of Building Sciences in 2012. Now, if you think that's all I'm going to say, he has a much greater history. He founded actually a pretty prominent firm, Kieran Timberlake, in 1984. The firm has received over 50 design awards and over 160 design citations. They've won numerous competitions. In 2008, the Aia Firm Award was granted to the firm. And just to let you know about this award, one given a year if they give it, and it's inscribed permanently. The firm's name is inscribed permanently on the walls of the building. And just to let you know, the person that designed the walls of those buildings was our own Howard Lucas, who passed away a week and a half ago, who was on our board. So a little connection back to the BAC. The firm also received the Cooper National Design Award. They are generally recognized for their work and their belief in beautifully crafted, thoroughly made buildings, holistically integrated to the site, program, and people. The projects range from one you'll see tonight, I think more extensively, the new Embassy of the United States in London, all the way to the Cellophane House, which is a fully recyclable, energy-gathering dwelling exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art. A wide range of projects. He's co-authored 5 books on architecture since 2002. He served as the Eero Saarinen Distinguished Professor of Design at Yale University, and he held the Max Fisher Chair at the University of Michigan. He's taught at Princeton University, University of Texas at Austin, and he currently teaches at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design. So, without further ado, let me introduce to you our Cascieri lecturer, James Timberlake, FAIA.
Good evening, everybody. It's indeed a pleasure to be here in Boston and to be here at the Boston College. This is a lecture I was invited to over a year ago, and because of schedule, it got postponed until now, and I'm indeed honored to be the 25th speaker of the Arcangelo Cascieri lecture series. And to be in this building's always intrigued me, and I've been around the outside of it, but never been in it. And so it's also an honor to be in here. I've got lots to show, and I know there's another class that comes in here, so I'm going to move this along, so that there can be hopefully some questions near the end. I'm going to take you through kind of an arc of Kieran Timberlake, certainly current projects, some unbuilt, some that are built, and some that are under construction, which really is kind of the arc of who we are. We try to leave not too many things unbuilt. So we begin here, in our own office, a kind of converted bottling plant in Philadelphia, old brewery bottling plant in Philadelphia, designed by a Paul Cray protege, post-World War II, 1947, that we've taken over and moved ourselves into. And it's just a wonderful, like this building, it's just a wonderful sandbox that you come to every day and, kind of open up, the kinds of things that you want to open up on that particular day and go to work through the arc of sun moving through the space, naturally ventilated, places to build, places to pin up, places to meet with clients. Very different kind of place in many offices in the sense that everybody in the space is on wheels so that we can reconfigure teams very quickly and nimbly. Throughout the arc of a day, a lot of different things happen in this particular space, which you'll see through the course of the lecture. But before I get there, something happened last fall that has, I'm an Obama appointee, so, just give me a minute and a half of a rant here. This is happening. That is happening. That's February 2017 in California. This got appointed. And this guy wants to help take down the EPA and the USGBC and a lot of other initiatives that architects and landscape architects and urban designers are all involved in. And we need to be vigilant. And as architects, as practitioners, if you don't belong to the Architecture 2030 Challenge, you should join up and you should encourage your clients to participate in this, because this guy is a non-believer. He doesn't believe in climate change, doesn't believe in global warming. Whether you do or you don't is really not part of the political discourse. It's really about the fact that this is happening, and this is what we're involved in. And so you can leave him and the personality behind, the personalities in Washington altogether. But buildings consume 70% of the electrical load in the United States. You see the percentage that we contribute to greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide, not to mention other effects on the environment. And we, as ethical and principled designers and architects and landscape architects and urban designers, need to constantly have this in mind as we're going forward. And this will be, a little bit of a thread through the lecture, so I'm not going to belabor it at this particular point, because it's who we are and what we do as a firm, as Kieran Timberlake, that informs everything that we do on a daily basis. And so projects like this at Middlebury College, we've worked in Boston, we've done 4 projects at Harvard, 1 at MIT, we're working down the road at Brown. We've worked throughout the United States and around the world. And so I'm not going to show you the Boston projects because you can go visit them, but I'm going to show you some things that we have done. And this is up at Middlebury College, but you know, the reclaimed wood in this particular building comes from reclaimed buildings in Vermont and associated with the college, or it got harvested sustainably from the forest lands that the college owns. And it sits, you know, as a dining hall, as an event space. It sits as part of a cluster of residential buildings in the trees, nested into the hillside. And the rock that was harvested to create the basement for this particular building formed the gabions around the outside of the building. We've renovated buildings like Eero Saarinen's Morrison Stiles College, you know, and tried to bring new meaning and new life to those kinds of spaces. This was an unbeloved building at Yale, a building that students, you know, felt like they weren't getting history and they weren't being part of by being in this particular building. And now it is a loved building because one of the things that we did was we excavated a moat that Saarinen could provide, which provided light into the undercroft of this building and opened up a whole realm of spaces that contrasted with the student spaces that Saarinen had provided, and creates a whole different college experience now for the students at Yale. We were invited by MoMA to provide a house, you know, as part of their home design show in 2008, just prior to the recession. And the brief for this initially sent out to 800 architects, then whittled down to 400 architects, and then ultimately they selected 6, and 5 houses ultimately were delivered to this site. Was deliver a house on this site within 30 days of the opening of the show, and at the end of the show, take it down within 21 days because there's going to be a building built on this particular site. Well, that building didn't commence construction for another 7 years due to the recession, but this brief allowed us to investigate and extend a book that we had written, Refabricating Architecture, that we looked at off-site construction, but also allowed us to look at a variety of other technologies like ETFE, the use of aluminum, the recycled content of a house such as this, and we were able to achieve a 99% return on the life cycle costs of this particular building through the choices of materiality and through the ability to take the house down after it was built. So this video is a time lapse taken over 6 days. 85% of the house was put up in 6 days. The other 15% of the house was built in the other 15 days just prior to the show. 750,000 people went through this house. There is a book called Cellophane House that we chronicled all of the construction of this and the design of it. It was taken down, it was stored, some of it was repurposed, but it was recovered. We recovered 99% of the recycled content of the life cycle cost of the building. And that's a really important fact that I think one of the things that we're not doing as architects and landscape architects is really taking into consideration the fact that this little house in Manhattan, you know, really was an experiment, you know, to demonstrate the fact that when we make buildings like this, we should be considering not only the investment of the cost of time and the money and the materiality that are going into buildings such as this, but the recovery of them once they're complete and once they're used up. And so this little house sits next to another little building in New York, both of which are now gone. Todd and Billy's building, the museum, and our little house are now replaced by a skyscraper in New York. As Glenn and Karen mentioned, you know, we've written actually now 7 books. Our most recent book is Alluvium, chronicling the research of the University of Pennsylvania students over 10 years in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And, you know, we try to share our research and our work with the community, with students, with other academics, with the profession. And this is something that we've been compelled to do, ever since we were students, researchers on our own in school, and continue to do as practitioners and professionals. So what makes up architecture? When Glenn and I were going to school back in the day, in the olden days, there were basically three things that were imparting to us, structure, form, and materiality. These are all but, a few that we left off of this chalkboard of all the things that we now take into consideration as architects as we make architecture in each and every day as we go through the daily life of being an architect and making the buildings that we make. And so money, which, most architects don't want to have anything to do with, is, and budgets are very much an act of design. Life cycle costs, environment, energy, materiality, not just form and not just how something looks and not just the kind of delight, the commodity, firmness and delight of a building. But all of these elements are things that, we in each and every day are asking ourselves, how do we extend what we're making and make it meaningful so that it lasts a long time and becomes something really important. We plan, we do, we monitor, we certify. I don't know why this mic keeps going in and out. It may be because I'm leaning over the top of it, but I'm going to move it up a little bit. But we plan, we do, we monitor, we learn, we design, we innovate and invent. And we're ISO certified because we want to understand the processes that we have in our office so that we don't have to worry about them anymore, but we revisit them every year. And we get reviewed by Lloyd's of London. And we're one of only a handful of architects in the United States that is ISO certified. It's pretty common in the UK, pretty common in Asia, but very uncommon here. And it's one of the reasons why I think architects are not held in quite the same esteem here as they are in other parts of the world, because we don't treat people's briefs with the due diligence that we need to treat them. We research deeply. We ask queries of our architects and our clients every day. This is just but some of the arenas that we're in at this particular point, and some of the actors within that arena. On a daily basis in the office, if this was a kind of snapshot of the office of 130 people at Timberlake at this particular point, these are some of the queries that are going on at any one time that are related to some of the projects that are going on. We make things. We have a 3.5 bay shop on the ground floor. We pour concrete. We weld. We build things. We experiment with materialities. We invent things as well. And then we study them and bring them to the fore to our clients. These are just but some of the things that we had up for the AIA convention last year in May in our shop, some of the screens that we've designed for buildings out on the West Coast, some of the mock-ups of whole building elements that we have brought clients into, the experimentation with concrete for our house that we're prototyping in India that we hope to take a cross-section of some of the 27 million housing deficit in India with this particular off-site constructed mass customizable house. But these are some of the shape of the panels that help take the energy off the walls and the experimentation of that. The brown fin that's going up at the engineering school, the GFRC fin that's going on the new engineering school at Brown University, and the UCSB screen that is three-dimensionally milled and then cast that provides for natural ventilation, screening light, but also helps take the energy off the building in a way that a radiator might take energy through, through a scrim. It takes the energy, absorbs it into this particular panel and dissipates it before it gets into the, past the rain screen into the rest of the building. These struts you'll see later as part of the New London Embassy and a kind of snapshot of that strut. This strut is part of the mock-up that went up in York, Pennsylvania, and they were going to throw this away, and we don't throw anything away. We try to repurpose it so it sits in our office. Over 600 of them are on the outside of the New London Embassy as part of the screen that forms the outside envelope, which you'll see in a minute. That house in India has been a 5-year experiment. We're in a joint venture as partners with some venture capitalists there. We've taken apart the climate, the resource conservation, the cost modeling, the logistics for this particular model. We've mass customized it so that it can be 30 meters square or up to 90 meters square. It can be from G1 to G4, all using the same elements that are precast and off-site constructed. And then we've prototyped it in 2 phases in India. And this is the second prototype that is now complete. And we're just getting ready to do the first 250 units of this housing in Ahmedabad next year at this time. Some low-income housing that we hope will help stem some of the deficit in India. We do a lot of urban design and transportation projects. This is the west porch of the City Hall in Philadelphia, sitting in the center of the city. And that park that you see in the foreground was a plaza that was done originally at the Bicentennial in 1976. We were commissioned along with Olin to revision this park, reconnected to the transportation hub underneath City Hall that crisscrosses Market Street and Broad Street, going under that Empire-style building. And this new, more European, almost like landscape, is programmed with a fountain that turns into a hockey rink, ice skating rink in the wintertime, a lawn that they show movies on in the summertime, and these 2 portals, this arc of glass that frames City Hall from the west side and forms the portals into the subway. Before, when people came out of the Philadelphia subway, they seemed beaten down and downtrodden when they got to City Hall. And they were kind of like coming up out of these kind of almost rat-like grates, That's how we treat people in Philadelphia. And when we got this commission, we decided we were going to treat people a little differently. And so these portals, this arc that is tied to William Penn's hat as the radius, forms these 2 arcs that kind of grasp City Hall. They're laminated glass. They're laid up just the way City Hall is, but out of glass. And they form these naturally lit portals back into the subway station down below. And so people now are, feeling elevated coming out of that subway stop, as they come up into City Hall or go back down into the subway. You see more people smiling at one another and talking to one another. And it seems like, this is how architecture can elevate one's life and affect people in a positive way. And that's really, something that you want to come away with when you've achieved the end result of a building, or a project. We're working on high rises. This was a project that was speculated in Philadelphia. It's now being superseded by a second phase of the Comcast building on a site that's just off to the right there. But this was a 30-story building, the tallest building that we would have done. But the brief for this, like Boston, sliver sites, not unlike the kind of footprint of this building that somebody might say, look, there's higher and better value for this land, and we're going to get more out of it by going up taller. This speculation was, how many square feet could we get on this particular site, but also have it be iconic on the city skyline. But there were these rules and regulations about, a sky plane adjustment to the Philadelphia City zoning code that affected daylight into the streets, where this building really had to, the perimeter of this building really had to be sculpted in a very, very different kind of way. And so we developed, as I mentioned, we invent things. So we developed a software program in-house that turned that analog zoning diagram into something that we could then model in real time a variety of different ways and look where we were busting the sky plane. So you'll see in just a moment in this particular diagram, everything in red is a bust. So we had to lay that wall back and shape the building in such a way to allow that building to get taller, but also to maximize the amount of square footage in that building. And so we went through, these are but 30 of about 90 iterations of modeling that and then sending it to the printer and then showing it to the client. And then modeling it in real time, to look at the environmental impact on the building, not only in terms of reflectivity back into the neighborhood, but also the energy consumption on some of the shapes of the building. So that we could lower its energy profile, both internally to the building, but outside the building. So these are just, but some of the shapes that we were taking a look at and how they might be affected by the environmental impact on that glass wall. Ultimately, this was the scheme that was looked at and obviously taken to a potential tenant that they elected to actually join a much taller building on the west half of the city skyline. So this site still remains vacant, but you can see how the faceting of this wall gave us both performance and maximizing, programmatic envelope for return on investment on the building. And so this was just modeled in context. The lobby, kind of sliver of light that came through adjacent to the adjacent school building and brought into the lobby, and then a view from kind of midpoint in the skyline. We're currently working on another option on this particular site that looks at a much, much taller building because they've expanded the footprint of this by taking the site next door and some of the remainder of the block. And so we're hopeful that this becomes a project downstream. We've done a number of houses, around the United States. This is in Pound Ridge, New York. And it's a Revolutionary War site that is, the clients bought. It was a historical site, but it wasn't conserved by any stretch of the imagination. There's a third growth forest on that particular site, lots of rock outcroppings. And the clients bought this site and decided that they were going to take, I think it was about 140 acres. They were going to take 10 acres of that and then turn the other 130 acres back over to a conservancy so that in perpetuity nobody else would build on the rest of this particular site. And there are monumental outcroppings on this site. I mean, monumental rock outcroppings that just poke through. And these rocks are, several millions of years old that have been eroded and have been exposed to the property. So how do you build on a site like this? Maintaining kind of views in the landscape, perching the house in a way that it both has privacy from the road, but minimizes disturbance to the flora and fauna. And so, we walked the site, we discovered, some natural barrens between the rock outcroppings that might form a kind of perch, for the house, and elevated it from the road so that it took, when the trees drop off in the fall, the deciduous trees drop off in the fall, it takes long views and gets abundant natural light during the winter months into the house. But building among rock, is a really difficult act of design. It's something that has to take a lot of consideration. These were art collectors. Obviously, they were interested in having a spectacular house. I think we all, the client and ourselves, were very interested in having a light touch, on this particular site. And so we didn't want to blast rock out of the way and do a lot of other disturbances. So obviously the pathway up to the house was a kind of natural climb to this particular perch. The perch between the rocks meant that we weren't removing a lot of the rock for foundations. And then the sort of cladding of the building became, a question of how does this sit in this natural landscape and both be in it and of it at the same time. And so, part of the light touch was developing a technological method of construction which employed SIPs, so that the foundation was kind of perched, and then the panels for the floors and the walls and the ceilings and the roof all came and all went up in about a matter of about a couple of weeks, maybe a month. And then obviously we added cladding and finishes to that. And the finishes on the house I'll talk about in just a minute, but here's the ground floor of the house and the kind of service portal of the house, a drop-off just below this, and then the main entry to the right-hand side of that plan with a stair up, which brings you to the other part of the private part of the house, but leads you to a bridge between the rock outcroppings to the main living sector of the house, which had an entertainment room, a small study, and a kind of living room, dining, kitchen area, and then the rest of the bedrooms and studies were down that other hallway. So here's that lower stair portal. You walk in, it's a little bit like walking into a cave, a rock outcropping, but partly made of stone, and then the kind of lighter construction depicted in wood in this particular case, as it lifts up into the house, and it arrives, at that upper level. So you see the stair and the private hallway with some of the art displayed. The two sons who are out of the house play music and very much are engaged in the house when they come back. But part of being in the house in that particular zone of the house was then discovering where frame views of some of that landscape were best kind of positioned, not only to maximize light into the house, but also views back out to that landscape, and creating those kinds of moments of the kind of man-made moment against that natural outcropping. But each one of those frame views becomes a kind of painting, if you will, a kind of snapshot in its own right. We move through the landscape to and from different sectors of the house. Abundant natural light pours through the house, can be naturally ventilated when they want to, but because of the art in the house, they have to be careful about doing that. The living dining room, opens up out into the forest and captures, 4 seasons of life right outside the windows. And then the house itself nestles in amongst the rock. And we used 4 different polishes of stainless steel on variegated depth panels to create that kind of almost dystopian wall that is, that begins to mirror the landscape, but then also blurs the landscape, a kind of literal and phenomenal transparency, a kind of mirroring of the landscape, but then mixed in with the windows. So the literal transparency of the glass is adjacent to the phenomenological, more ephemeral mirroring of the landscape and oscillates in that kind of relationship. And so you get these snapshots of the low polish and the high polish, juxtaposed, which blurs this house. I don't want to call it camouflage because that really wasn't our intention, because we want you to see the house, but at the same time, we want it to oscillate between being of that landscape and in it going forward. So, just different kinds of seasons of that snapshot of the same place and how the house begins to change your appreciation and understanding of it. And then, obviously, in the snow, last winter, with the deciduous trees having dropped and these 40-mile views across the landscape of Pound Ridge, New York, long views across that landscape. And just simple moments of detail, where, snow is caught, on a ledge of the panel, just in the way that the snow is caught on the ledges of the rock, a kind of, a moment of consideration that was intentional, that is part of the act of being an architect, that intentionality, and having, designed it in such a way that obviously it doesn't leak, but also provides you with those kinds of special moments. We do lots of college and university buildings. We do lots of institutional buildings, and I'm going to take you through now a couple additional projects before I get to the embassy. This is at Rice University. We've done lots of work at Yale, most of the college renovations at Yale, and several at Harvard, which we've enjoyed doing. And there's a kind of active discovery working in those old buildings like we did at Morrison Stiles, where you're working in a 70 and 80-year-old building, but you have that history. Just like if you walk into the rare book room here, the simultaneous history of that old rare book room, in this modern building, it coexists. And so, we like working on old buildings that allow us to discover that, but just in the way that Scarpa, kind of archaeologically, it would mine, the history of some of the buildings that he intervened in. I think we've done the same thing at Harvard and Yale and some of those college houses where we've found new histories and juxtaposed that modern history against that old history, so that one tells the other about itself, and that new students coming through those particular spaces are imbued with that old history and that new history, their personal history, at the same time. Likewise, at Rice, in this particular case, we're amongst old history, a century of which, begins up at the main building, Ralph Adams Cram, and the whole campus, and some of the early buildings, and then into the 60s campus down around this portion down here, in the 1980s, the Science and Engineering campus, our building, that kind of slip bars in the middle there. It was a found site that this was the appropriate place for the program, but the university didn't know whether or not 110,000 to 140,000 square feet of program could fit into this particular zone and still maintain a landscape that was of meaning in this particular area. So the U-shaped building was a 1980s building, and many of those other buildings around the north side of the building, were all from the kind of 1960s. But there was a disproportionate landscape that went through, a very long, thin landscape that went through, that was kind of undefined, that was kind of un-Rice-like, if you will. Most Rice landscapes are of a certain kind of proportion and relationship, and then you get to them via walks that are kind of, the warp and weft of the campus. This long linear landscape running through the whole thing was kind of odd because, it seemed like Rice and the architects had been afraid to intervene in that particular lozenge of landscape. And here's that warp and weft and those deep connections, those axial relationships that slip and slide against one another, and the transitions of arcades that knit all of those together and are part of the proportions that the buildings kind of lay down onto the landscape themselves. The climate there is hot and humid and wet. They get lots of rain, particularly in the last many years. And so climate became a very deep, important piece of understanding this building because it's a lab building. It already has a pretty high carbon and energy footprint already just by the nature of pressurizing labs and ventilating them. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was think about how this building could make that landscape better, but also improve people's use of that landscape during the seasons that they're at the campus. And then use that arrangement to our advantage from the energy and daylight modeling point of view. And so we pulled the program apart, slipped the two bars, lifted one bar up off the ground, engaged the other bar into the ground because some of the labs had to be ground coupled for research purposes, and then understood where the daylight was coming from and arranged the building in such a way that the labs that were already high intensity users were put to the south side of the building, and then a wall a screen wall put in front of that helps take the energy off of those labs, but then opening up the offices and the student spaces to abundant natural light and a thinner bar that allowed us to get a lot of daylight into that building. So here are those two buildings, decoupled, pulled apart, one lifted up, redefining that middle landscape, and then redefining and rethinking the whole notion of that landscape slipe or slip that goes through Cram's term, SLYPE, slipe, but it was a bastardization of slip, running through the building. And so there's two that cross through here, and the buildings frame that. And that slipe is then opened up, to allow for, air to ventilate through that landscape and be pulled up and out and through the portal of the building, so that this outdoor space is not only shaded in the hot portions of the day, but also we get a microclimate underneath this building that is about 5 degrees cooler than the surrounding landscape and has a breeze to it when the rest of Houston and Rice is still. So it works, and we have proof that it works. And so this, because we measure our buildings and we monitor what we do. And so you can see the daylight coming into the spaces, the bridges that connect the building, this undercroft of the building lifted up, creating that shaded outdoor classroom and gathering space, the kind of pilotis, if you will, the columns becoming a kind of fictive hedge of trees unto themselves. And then the entrance to the building off of that nexus of paths, taking you into a lobby that takes you up through the building and down through the building through a monumental stair, past dichroic glass, which is part of the discovery of the physics and physics engineering building work at Rice. Student spaces that are visually connected to one another, so you get the lab rats out of the labs and get them into spaces where they can exchange ideas and commune and converse with one another. And then, of course, the lab spaces that are highly technical, these intense sort of garage-like spaces where laser experiments are going on and become these sort of netherworlds of research. And then that lifted up bar, slipping through that long space, creating two smaller, now properly connected courtyards, on either end, and then these views through the building connected to the spaces around them. A frit on the front, on the north side of the building because of the slippage of the sun coming around that side. A Penrose pattern, the glass at dusk, changes color, so this building really becomes this kind of chameleon in the landscape. A competition, so I'm going to take you to last two projects, two competitions. One we lost and one we won. How many architects show you the competitions that they lost? Come on. Give me a little bit of credit for that, right? So this is the old London Embassy. This was a competition in 1960 by Saarinen, which he won. Became the embassy. This is a view in about 1963, 64, about the time that this building was built here. When you could bound up the stairs past the Marine Guard and kind of, wave hello and take in the glory of the main space and not be patted down and forever run through, the kind of security detail that they now run you in. And this street is now closed and it has two CACs in the front of it, and you have to go through all kinds of machinations to get into this building. And they've grown out of this building. This building was designed for 200 people. And it's now got 650 people in it, and it's got one air change per hour, because that's what it was designed to have back in the 1960s. So they've sold it, and that enabled our project to happen, which you'll see in a moment, a real estate deal that created enough money to not only pay for fees and construction, but also property in London. That's how valuable this particular space is. And this is going to be turned into condominiums and a hotel. Not by the US government, but by a private entity. So the whole brief here was how to do that. And we were up against Foster and Chipperfield, who ultimately won the competition. So we carved out the building, retained Saarinen's facade, re-imbued some of the embassy spaces to be ballroom and lobby spaces, provided two condominium entrances, put them on the back around a landscape that engages the Mews in London on that side, and then wrapped the hotel around the northeast and south sides of the building, facing out to Grosvenor Square, and restored the square. And so we looked at a variety of modeling circumstances because we had to carefully fit this program within it, a kind of diagram of not only our initial thoughts about the kind of sketch of that building, but then pulling the building apart from Grosvenor Square and the landscape and connecting that landscape into the hotel and the building, retaining Saarinen's facade as a screen wall, as a part of an active wall with a new envelope behind it and a new structure, because the old structure was so insignificant, unsubstantial, that it really had to be taken down to its foundations and put back. But it's a listed building, so it had to be retained. And so this is a section through that with that new landscape at the roof behind the building, the hotel at the front, the condominiums in that corbelled section at the back, and all the service spaces of the hotel. A kind of deep investigation of how to make an active curtain wall in that London zone and how it would participate energy-wise. And we found that we could exceed, by significant amounts, any hotel residential construction by doing this, through deep analysis with our engineers. These views that were taken in as part of the competition, re-engaging it to Grosvenor Square, restoring the street, creating a new public entrance, restoring the square, adding a new story that was allowed to be seen above the listed building, but provided an additional layer of rooms on top of the building. And these views created as part of the competition. And then views in the lobby. This is the actual lobby of of Saarinen design with that crisscrossed structure and the gold columns, but re-envisioned as a new hotel lobby, a new hotel restaurant, and condominium and hotel rooms, within the building, all done to display to the client as part of the competition. We thought we had this one. Interestingly enough, I think Chipperfield's scheme is almost identical to ours. And we don't begrudge that, but we think that we were certainly onto something. So we wish them lots of luck. So the competition that we won, and I'll finish in about 3 minutes and then be able to take some questions. The New London Embassy, 500,000 square feet. You saw what they're growing out of. 40 sites investigated around London, ultimately found a site between Wandsworth between Vauxhall and Battersea, the Battersea Power Station of Pink Floyd fame, which is now being renovated into condominiums and commercial spaces. But a building that was the catalyst to rethinking this post-industrial site along the river, and you'll see this transform, and I'll click it back and forth, but Covent Garden Market is that low crisscross building in the foreground. MI6 headquarters are down here that you saw in the last Bond movie get blown up, and the Pink Floyd power plant down at the end over there. And so this is what it's going to look like in about 2025. And the embassy sits right in the middle of that. And we didn't know what any of that was going to look like, but we had to design a building in a context that didn't exist. And so how do you begin with a kind of tabula rasa in that kind of way, knowing full well that the scale of these buildings, all determined by a view cone from the Houses of Parliament, blocking the taller buildings, but exposing all the shorter buildings along the way, that we had to fit within that and also meet their brief, which stood about this high when we printed it out, but be one of the first elements that helped to transform this neighborhood. So here you see it from the southwest view, looking across Houses of Parliament, the London Eye, up over that way, the Shard up to the upper right. So we began with a diagram working with Olin, Laurie Olin, our landscape architect, and his team, thinking that there were 4 parallel lines, Pimlico across the River Thames, Nine Elms Lane, a high street, very high-speed high street, which is now, with all the construction, has calmed significantly, just transformed in 3 years. A linear park that was part of the Greater London Authority demand to string all of these projects together. A landscape that was part of the brief of the embassy, and then the railway viaduct, which formed a kind of wall off Wandsworth to the south, and how to knit all of that together. This was ultimately the master plan of all those projects, 5 different other briefs of developers and architect teams coming together, slightly transformed since that time, but most of it now under construction. Richard Rogers, Wilkinson Eyre and Foster, SOM and others, all participating in aspects of property, new property valuation over in that particular zone, one of the largest last development zones in London. And the linear park being a critical piece of stringing all of that together, but the embassy right in the middle of that with a prospect of the River Thames, looking over to Pimlico across the way. And so this 4.5 acre site, had a very strict envelope requirement all the way around it, which we had to fit all the program in, and still retain 3 entrances, a main entrance on the right, for embassy personnel, a consular entrance to the south for all the visitors coming for visas and other embassy business, and a service CAC or pavilion to get into the service zones of the building, and then retaining a publicly accessible third of the site overlooking the Thames with a pond that a public park knits this linear park into that landscape and becomes part of that engagement of the building in that zone. We looked at a variety of different arrangements on the site, a cube, a stack of this program arranged cubically on the site was not only a good proportion building, but a properly oriented building and north, south, east, west, but was the most efficient form for environmental and energy consumption reasons and for doing the office spaces in the building. So all of this kind of came together serendipitously during the competition phase against Morphosis, Paycobb Fried, and Richard Meyer. As we looked at about 30 schemes during that competition phase and realized this was the most efficient thing that the US government could build, but also be beautiful as well. So we knitted the landscape around the building, brought them up through into the building through 6 other landscapes that are tapestries of landscapes, fictive and real, that mark US landscapes around the country so that embassy business can move through these landscapes, but they provide breakout areas in the building so that people don't have to leave during the course of the day, but can go to these indoor and outdoor landscapes, 3 of which are open to the outside. Building's oriented due north, south, east, west. All the other development came around it. The park engages the base of the building, and public art is part of the brief in the program. The main lobby, which is a 2-story space, is part of the monumental entry of this new building. A public gallery that people can come to for embassy business and meetings and conferences. And that also is engaged with abundant natural light facing out to the north in the park and art on the walls, and then the consular offices where visas, on 2 levels are up in the building. The rest of it's basically a common office building. We did a really deep dive energy-wise. This is going to meet LEED Platinum and BREEAM Excellent, 2 different disparate energy management briefs that we had to meet. We do that through a layered exterior wall, and I'll just get to the construction photos. So this is about 2.5 years ago with the core rising and the frame coming up, the frame completed and the curtain wall going up, the outside envelope being provided initially. This was about 1 year ago when they began all of this. And then more recently, as that outer envelope is being completed, ETFE, solar panels to gather energy both on the roof and the walls. This helps sunshade the glassed wall building, but allows us to get abundant natural light into the rest of the building. The north face is barren of this ETFE shroud, but this provides its form and its iconic identity. And you can see it in the context of some of the other residential structures going up, and both light coming out of the building now and coming into the building through that ETFE shroud, and the different light play on it. So, they've named it the sugar cube, the flash cube, this cube, they have a lot of cheeky names for it that I'm sure will get, ripped, in the British press, coming forward. But the light play on this is phenomenal, both inside and outside the building. And you get very different personalities on different days, depending on the London weather. So here's a sunny day, and here's a gray day, and how that ETFE shrouds. And you can get a sense of the scale. These guys are working on tensioning the ETFE on drops over here, and how the corners open up on the side at dusk from the north and then from the river. And thank you very much. I have 1 minute to take a couple of questions. So.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to sit so I can rest my leg. Yeah.
Have some water. Okay. Do I have a question from the audience? You're up to bat first.
Hi. I was wondering, as far as like your fabrication area of your office, do you find yourself more experimenting with like new materials to see like the feasibility, or to like prove that it's possible to a client?
Both and. You'd probably expect that answer, I would think. Both and. I mean, it depends on the project, obviously. But part of the motto is fail early and fail fast, right? You know, as architects, for years and years and years, the first time anybody would see the real construction of this was when it was built and occupied for the first time. So this is an experiment, right? All of this. And then the experiment is something we all live in, you know, or have to occupy or use. And what we're trying to do through three-dimensional modeling, through BIM, through measuring, through monitoring, through a lot of other science that we were able to bring to things early, is to prove things earlier and fail in our shop before we fail with a mock-up at the site or fail in the building. And it helps extend the quality of the building, it helps get the performance right, because what we're anticipating is modeled and then, you know, kind of pre-constructed, if you will, before it actually is built for the occupying time.
Thank you.
Yeah. Did she single you out? Is that what happened?
You
Yeah.
ran me down.
Wow.
On the different project types that you work on, do you find that there's a certain project type that you learn more on or easier to learn with? Like, are the larger ones usually residential too? You think residential a little bit quicker, maybe you can have some turnaround?
That's a great question. You know, and oftentimes I get the question, what are you working on right now that you love the most, right? You know, I love it all, you know, and I mentioned to Glenn and Karen that you know, I wanted to be an architect since I was 5, so I'm like a pig in mud, you know. But what you learn on, everything's got an aspect of learning, and everything is revealing something new as you're going through it. And if you ever get to a point where you're just repeating something over and over and over again because that's what you're familiar with, I think it would be time to sort of check it up and think about moving on to something else, perhaps even another profession. But, you know, we've learned so much on the embassy, but the houses provide a scale of craft and control that is difficult in a larger institutional or even governmental building. So they all have their merits, and they all have, you know, an arc of things that you're able to learn from. And the best aspect of that is having it all in the office at the same time. And because, you know, but it takes all of us in the office real adaptability, because, you know, while we're scaled to do very small things, and we've got right now a 16,000 square foot parish hall for a church, a historic church in Philadelphia going on in the office. We've got another very, very small project that's only about 6,000 square feet. We've got a 30 building, 1,500 acre site being under construction, you know, that we're doing for the U.S. government. So it's, you know, it's great to have those different scales of hats to put on, you know, and to really think about operating differently, because those 30 buildings, you had to come up with a kind of paradigm and a language, because you just simply couldn't bespokely design each one of them uniquely. So that there's a kind of catalog, I think 3 tiers of catalogs of buildings that we designed for that particular site. And they're codified through color and typology and construction. And they're of different scale, and they sit in the landscape in a different place. But in the end, that campus will look like a campus because of that. And it'll have a reasonable amount of detail in it, but they're not designed to the 9th degree like the Pound Ridge House. So.
Hey, James. Richard
Yes.
here. I'm a second semester MArch student.
Yeah.
I just want to say quickly, I had the pleasure of working on Brown's New School of Engineering,
Great.
doing the clean room design,
Yeah.
and sat through countless meetings with Rachel and Mark from your office.
Oh, great. Thank
It was
you.
a great experience.
Yeah.
And also, I could attest to your mock-ups that you guys do. You had an on-site mock-up of the fin facade. That was really interesting.
It wasn't fake news, get that.
That was real large scale. I saw it in person. Great design, actually, by the way.
Yeah, thank you.
So my question, going back to the kind of the beginning of your slides, you mentioned climate 2030 and
Yeah.
the effects of global warming and rising sea levels. Maybe you could speak quickly to some of those strategies that you've used in some of these buildings,
Yeah.
and kind of what those influences or design drivers were. And then I guess the question is, are you guys as an office considering resilient design in each of these projects that you take on, and how much does that play a part in your everyday kind of process?
Well, post-Brown, we've signed up for the 2030 challenge. And one of the reasons we didn't sign up initially, a lot of architects kind of glommed onto that, was because we weren't certain we could meet it. And so we went through almost 4 years or 5 years of not being signed up to it, because we wanted to prove to ourselves that we think we could meet those challenges. And we've done a lot of measuring. The AIA's published some of that measuring, and a very, very small percentage of architects is actually meeting those challenges. And that's, I think you're going to hear a lot more about this, because as all of us begin to daylight this more and more, not about boasting, but about challenging one another to do better, I think what you're going to find is that we have to step up to our clients and say, we need to do this and you need to participate. So how are we doing that? Post-Brown, on a lot of the buildings at this particular point, we do go through a goal-setting exercise. That's, we measure all the way through as part of the ISO's KTMS process, looking at those goals and revising those goals as we get through each phase of the project, but bringing our team members along to that and the client as well. But for instance, this little parish hall that we're doing, we went to our client, we went to our engineers and said, look, this is a building, 16,000 square feet. We should be able to naturally ventilate this building, even in Philadelphia. We should be able to do it in a hybrid-like way. We ought to be able to perhaps meet a net zero building at that scale. And so some of it's through goal setting and trying to achieve those goals, like we did on the embassy. The goals in 2010 at the outset of that competition, when we were one of 4 firms, was there's no reason in the UK why we shouldn't be able to meet BREEAM excellent, if not outstanding, and LEED gold or LEED platinum. And we brought that back to the Department of State and the US government and continue to hammer that through every phase and measured it against things like when they were doing VE on the project, well, this is what you're taking away. Do you want to do that? You've publicly stated this. Do you want to take that away? And challenging them to think differently about where to make the adjustments in the budget. I mean, this building is on budget, and it's not a tax-driven building. This is not an appropriation from Congress. This is a budget established by a real estate amount of money, and we had to meet it. So those kinds of things are going back to the initiatives of resilient building, I think each and every client, each and every program is unique. And there is a certain imposition, I think, of process and principle and ethic of an architect on your client that you should be taking on at any one time in order to challenge them beyond just building space. And so for years and years and years, it was all about how beautiful can you make this, or how unique can the materials be, how unique could the form be. And so we'll throw money, head over heels at collecting buildings like that, and we'll ignore the energy profile or the life cycle profile or some of the other profiles of the building long term. And so you end up with museums that are really difficult to operate. You end up with that cost clients lots of money. You end up with building envelopes that are deteriorating after 20 years that, because they look beautiful for that significant, shot for the donor, but, have deteriorated over time because the architects and the engineers didn't invest in the effort to understand that that's what they were picking. So, those are the kinds of things that are part of resiliency and part of, doing the right thing for the environment, but doing the right thing not only now, but also for a future that is going to be beyond the time that Glenn and I are going to be here. And, when our kids are now in this position, and in the position that you're in. And that, that's the kind of ignorance that I think, and one of the reasons why I put Scott Pruitt up there is because he has fought the EPA for a decade as a congressperson and as a person from Oklahoma, and challenge it from a law point of view, just simply from the standpoint that he doesn't want governmental interference in his life. Well, I'm sorry, we all would like some less interference of some sort in our lives, whether it's coming from school administrators or whether it's coming from a professor or whether it's coming from a spouse or our kids or anybody else. But in the end, we're part of a community, and this globe is an island home. And yes, Musk will find a way to get to Mars, but it won't be in our life necessarily sustainable in our lifetime to be shipping people off to Mars. And so we have to think about ways of extending this island home. This is an island. And so far we haven't found any other community of island anywhere else in the galaxies. And so, in order to allow ourselves to continue to be here as a human race, we shouldn't be using up the resources that we were given, that we were born into. And we're one of the worst offenders. I mean, I have to say, not only as a profession, but as a entity, as a governmental entity, the United States of America, is amongst one of the worst, land performers of any in the world. And we do it because we can, and because we can tell people what to do. But it's not right, it's not ethical, it's not principled. And so we're 13 minutes after, and I'm going to have to say thank you all very much.
I want to thank you.